Before Heath Ledger became one of Hollywood's most respected actors, before the awards, before The Dark Knight, and before millions of people knew his name, he was simply a boy growing up in Perth, Western Australia. Heath Andrew Ledger was born on April 4, 1979 in Perth. He grew up in a family that was not part of Hollywood, and there was nothing about his childhood that guaranteed he would someday become an international movie star. His father, Kim Ledger, worked as a racing car driver and mining engineer, while his mother, Sally, was a teacher and later became involved in education. Heath had a younger sister, Kate, who would eventually become an important supporter of his acting ambitions. From an early age, Heath was energetic, curious and independent. He wasn't the kind of person who seemed satisfied with doing exactly what everyone expected. And that personality would eventually become one of the most important parts of his career. At school, Heath became involved in sports and other activities, but acting gradually began attracting his attention. He discovered that performing gave him something different. It allowed him to become someone else. To experiment. To express emotions. To step outside the ordinary world around him. For a young boy growing up thousands of miles away from Hollywood, acting might have seemed like an unlikely career. But Heath wasn't thinking about Hollywood yet. He was simply discovering what he enjoyed. During his teenage years, that interest became more serious. He began appearing in school productions and local theater. And something became increasingly obvious. He had natural confidence in front of an audience. But confidence wasn't the only thing that made Heath different. He had a willingness to take risks. He didn't seem interested in becoming famous simply for the sake of being famous. He wanted to perform. He wanted to experience different characters. And he wanted to see how far he could go. That ambition became clearer when he was still a teenager. Heath eventually left school before completing his final years of education, choosing instead to pursue acting. It was a major decision. There was no guarantee that it would work. There was no Hollywood contract waiting for him. There was no promise of success. He simply believed that acting was what he wanted to do. And he decided to take the risk. At around 16 years old, Heath moved toward professional acting. He began taking roles in Australian television and film. One of his early opportunities came with the television series Sweat, which featured young performers and gave Heath valuable experience in front of the camera. He then appeared in the Australian television series Roar. The series was ambitious, and although it didn't become a massive success, it gave Heath something extremely important. Experience. He was learning how professional productions worked. He was learning how to handle cameras. He was learning how to work with other actors. And most importantly, he was discovering what kind of performer he wanted to become. But Heath was still not satisfied. He wanted bigger opportunities. He wanted to challenge himself. And he began looking beyond Australia. By the late 1990s, Hollywood was becoming increasingly interested in Australian actors. Heath decided to take his chance. He moved to the United States. For someone still in his late teens, it was a huge step. He was leaving behind the country where he had grown up and entering an entertainment industry that was far more competitive. Hollywood was filled with young actors who wanted exactly the same thing. Success. Recognition. A career. Heath had to find a way to stand out. His first major Hollywood opportunities began arriving. He appeared in the teen comedy 10 Things I Hate About You in 1999. The movie became an important moment in his early career. Audiences noticed him. He was young, charismatic and had a natural screen presence. Suddenly, Heath Ledger wasn't just an Australian actor trying to find work. He was becoming a recognizable Hollywood newcomer. But success brought a new problem. People began trying to define him. Hollywood often likes simple categories. The handsome young actor. The romantic lead. The new teen heartthrob. And Heath was exactly the kind of actor who could easily have been placed into that category. But he didn't want to stay there. He understood that becoming known for one type of role could eventually become a limitation. So instead of simply accepting every opportunity that made him look like a traditional Hollywood star, Heath began looking for different characters. That decision would shape his entire career. He didn't want every role to look like the one before it. He wanted variety. He wanted difficult characters. He wanted stories that gave him something to explore. That mindset became especially important as his career developed. But before he could reach those challenging roles, Heath still had to prove himself. His next projects gradually showed audiences that he wasn't simply another young actor with a famous face. He had range. He could be charming. He could be serious. He could be vulnerable. And he could disappear into a character. That last quality would eventually become one of the defining features of his acting. But in the late 1990s, nobody knew how far that ability would take him. Heath was still young. He was still learning. And he was still trying to understand the industry around him. Hollywood could be exciting, but it could also be unforgiving. Every successful performance created expectations for the next one. Every mistake could become a setback. And every decision could shape the direction of his career. Heath's early success was therefore not simply a story about fame arriving overnight. It was the beginning of a much longer transformation. A teenager from Perth had crossed the world. He had entered Hollywood. He had gained attention. But he had not yet become the actor people would eventually remember. That journey was still ahead. And the roles that would truly change Heath Ledger's career were about to arrive. Because the young actor who could have chosen the easy path was beginning to make a very different choice. He wanted to be taken seriously. He wanted to challenge himself. And most importantly, he wanted to become more than the image Hollywood had created for him. The world had started noticing Heath Ledger. But it had not yet seen what he was capable of becoming. By the beginning of the 2000s, Heath Ledger had already achieved something many young actors spent years trying to accomplish. He had made it to Hollywood. But for Heath, simply becoming famous wasn't enough. After the success of 10 Things I Hate About You, Hollywood could easily have turned him into a familiar type, the handsome young actor appearing in romantic comedies and playing similar characters again and again. Heath saw the danger in that. He wanted something different. He wanted audiences to forget the actor and see the character. That decision influenced many of the roles he chose during the next few years. In 2000, he appeared in The Patriot, playing Gabriel Martin, the son of Mel Gibson's character. The film gave Heath a much larger international audience. He was no longer simply the young actor from a teen comedy. He was now working alongside major Hollywood stars in large-scale productions. But his ambitions were becoming increasingly obvious. He wasn't interested in building a career based only on popularity. He wanted variety. He wanted historical characters. He wanted romance. He wanted drama. He wanted roles that demanded something from him. Then came a completely different opportunity. In 2001, Heath starred in A Knight's Tale. The film was a mixture of medieval adventure, comedy and romance. He played William Thatcher, a young man who dreams of becoming a knight despite not being born into the aristocracy. The role allowed Heath to show a lighter and more charismatic side of himself. He could carry a movie. He could lead a cast. And audiences responded to him. But once again, Heath didn't simply follow the easiest path after success. He continued searching for different kinds of characters. He was building something unusual for a young Hollywood actor. Instead of moving toward a single recognizable image, he was moving away from it. That choice became even more important when he took on darker and more complicated roles. As the years passed, Heath's reputation changed. He was no longer simply being discussed as a promising young actor. People were beginning to talk about his ability. And then came one of the most important films of his career. Brokeback Mountain. The project was based on a short story by Annie Proulx and directed by Ang Lee. Heath played Ennis Del Mar, a quiet ranch worker whose life becomes deeply connected to another man, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. The role was unlike many of Heath's earlier performances. There was very little of the confident young Hollywood star audiences had seen before. Ennis was reserved. He struggled to express himself. Much of the character's emotion existed beneath the surface. For Heath, that required a completely different kind of performance. He couldn't rely on big speeches or dramatic gestures. He had to communicate through silence, expressions and small movements. The result surprised many people. Heath's performance received widespread critical acclaim. The film itself became an important cultural moment and received numerous awards and nominations. For Heath, it represented something even more significant. He had proven that he could carry serious dramatic material. He was no longer simply a promising young actor. He was becoming a respected one. But the success of Brokeback Mountain also brought something else. Greater public attention. Heath's personal life was now receiving more interest. He had begun a relationship with actress Michelle Williams, whom he had met while working on the film. The two eventually became engaged. In 2005, they welcomed their daughter, Matilda. Fatherhood became an important part of Heath's life. Away from movie sets and cameras, he now had responsibilities that had nothing to do with Hollywood fame. But balancing personal life with an increasingly demanding career wasn't always easy. Heath's professional reputation continued to grow. And he continued choosing roles that challenged expectations. He didn't want to repeat himself. He didn't want to become trapped by the success of one movie. Instead, he continued moving between different kinds of stories. Some roles were romantic. Some were dramatic. Some were darker. And some allowed him to experiment with completely different personalities. This was becoming the defining pattern of his career. Every time people thought they understood Heath Ledger, he changed direction. He was still young, but his choices were becoming more mature. He had moved from teenage television and romantic comedies into serious drama. And he was beginning to earn recognition from some of the industry's most respected filmmakers. But success also brought pressure. The more respected Heath became, the greater the expectations surrounding his next performance. He had already shown that he could surprise audiences. Now he had to do it again. And the next role he accepted would become the most talked about performance of his entire career. At the time, however, nobody could have predicted what it would become. In 2005, filmmaker Christopher Nolan began preparing a new Batman movie. The film would be called The Dark Knight. Batman had been portrayed many times before. And the Joker was one of the most famous villains in popular culture. But Nolan wanted something different. He wanted the character to feel unpredictable. Dark. Unsettling. And completely unlike a traditional comic book villain. Then Heath Ledger was chosen for the role. The reaction was immediate. Some people questioned the decision. Why would an actor known for romantic and dramatic roles play the Joker? Could he really make the character frightening? Could he make audiences forget every Joker they had seen before? Heath didn't answer those questions publicly. Instead, he went to work. He began preparing for the role. And what happened next would eventually change the way audiences looked at him forever. But before the world saw his Joker, Heath Ledger had already spent years preparing for this moment without realizing it. Every unusual role. Every difficult character. Every decision to avoid being typecast. Every attempt to disappear inside a performance. They had all been leading somewhere. Now he was about to enter the darkest role of his career. And this time, the challenge wasn't simply to act. It was to create a character audiences would never forget. By 2005, Heath Ledger had already proven that he was far more than the young actor Hollywood had first noticed. He had played romantic characters. He had appeared in historical dramas. He had earned critical respect through Brokeback Mountain. And he had become a father. But his next decision would take his career somewhere nobody expected. Christopher Nolan was preparing The Dark Knight, the second film in his Batman trilogy. The movie wasn't being designed as a simple superhero adventure. Nolan wanted a darker, more grounded story. And at the center of that story was one of the most famous villains in cinema history. The Joker. Casting the character was going to be difficult. The Joker had already been portrayed by memorable actors. Audiences already had expectations. So Nolan needed someone who could completely reinvent the character. That person was Heath Ledger. When the announcement became public, not everyone understood the choice. Some people were surprised. Others were skeptical. Heath was known for dramatic and romantic performances. Now he was going to play Batman's greatest enemy. But Heath didn't seem interested in copying what had already been done. He wanted to create his own Joker. And that meant starting from the beginning. He studied the character's personality. He considered how the Joker should move. How he should speak. How he should react. How he should make other people uncomfortable without simply shouting or becoming theatrical. The result was a character who felt unpredictable. The Joker wasn't simply a criminal. He seemed to enjoy chaos. He didn't appear to care about money in the traditional way. He wanted to prove that people could be pushed beyond their limits. That psychological element became one of the most important parts of Heath's performance. The Joker didn't need to constantly threaten people. Sometimes, simply standing there was enough. Heath changed his voice. He developed a distinctive rhythm of speaking. He created unusual physical movements. Even the way the character walked became part of the performance. The makeup was deliberately imperfect. The hair was messy. The clothing looked worn. Everything about the character suggested that this wasn't a polished movie villain. He looked like someone who had stepped out of the shadows. And Heath committed completely to the transformation. During filming, he often stayed deeply focused on the character. He worked closely with Christopher Nolan and the rest of the cast to build the Joker scene by scene. One of the most important elements was improvisation. There were moments when Heath experimented with the character's behavior rather than simply following a predictable pattern. One famous example involved the Joker's reaction to applause during a scene. Instead of behaving like a conventional villain, the character responds in a strange, uncomfortable way. Small choices like this helped make the Joker feel alive. Heath understood something important. The Joker shouldn't feel completely predictable. If audiences knew exactly what he was going to do next, the character would lose his power. So Heath constantly introduced uncertainty. Sometimes he was quiet. Sometimes he was almost playful. And sometimes he became frightening without warning. That contrast made the performance so memorable. But there was another important relationship behind the scenes. Heath was working with Christian Bale, who played Batman. Their characters were completely different. Batman represented order. The Joker represented chaos. Their scenes depended on that contrast. Neither character could completely overpower the other. The tension between them became the emotional engine of the film. And Heath's performance gave Batman a villain who didn't simply want to defeat him. The Joker wanted to challenge his beliefs. He wanted to prove that even someone who believed in justice could be pushed into darkness. This made their conflict feel larger than a normal superhero battle. It became psychological. And that was exactly what Christopher Nolan wanted. As filming continued, Heath's performance became more intense. But it is important to separate fact from later mythology. After Heath's death, many stories circulated about how completely he had isolated himself for the role or how dangerous the preparation had been. Some of those stories were exaggerated over time. What is clear is that Heath approached the character seriously and creatively. He wasn't simply putting on makeup and pretending to be the Joker. He was constructing a performance from the inside out. He wanted every detail to feel intentional. And the result began surprising everyone around him. Even people who had initially questioned the casting were starting to see something special. This wasn't the Heath Ledger audiences had known before. This was someone almost unrecognizable. The transformation was so complete that viewers could forget the actor behind the makeup. That is one of the greatest achievements an actor can accomplish. When audiences stop thinking about the performer and start believing entirely in the character, the performance has crossed another level. And Heath was reaching that level. But while The Dark Knight was being completed, Heath's personal life was also changing. His relationship with Michelle Williams had ended. He remained devoted to his daughter, Matilda. He was continuing to work on different projects. And his career was entering an extremely promising period. He was only in his late 20s. He had already achieved what many actors spend an entire lifetime trying to accomplish. And now he had created what would become one of the most iconic performances in modern cinema. But Heath wouldn't live to see the full impact of that performance. In January 2008, before The Dark Knight was released, Heath Ledger died in New York City at the age of 28. The news shocked Hollywood. He was young. His career was still developing. And one of his greatest performances had not even been seen by the public yet. Suddenly, the story of the Joker changed. The audience wasn't simply waiting for another Batman movie. They were waiting to see Heath Ledger's final completed performance. And when The Dark Knight was eventually released, the world discovered what Heath had created. It was unlike anything audiences had expected. The performance was disturbing, unpredictable and unforgettable. Heath didn't simply play the Joker. He disappeared into him. And that performance would eventually change the way superhero villains were portrayed forever. But before the world celebrated his work, there was a much more difficult story surrounding the actor himself. A story that required careful distinction between fact, rumor and speculation. Because Heath Ledger's death became surrounded by countless theories. And to understand what actually happened, we have to look beyond the myths. By the beginning of 2008, Heath Ledger was only 28 years old. Yet professionally, he had already reached a point many actors spend decades trying to reach. He had worked with respected directors. He had taken challenging roles. He had received major critical recognition. And he had just completed a performance that would eventually become one of the most celebrated portrayals of the Joker in cinema. But Heath would never see the full reaction to that performance. In the months before his death, he continued working. He had been involved with several film projects and was also spending time with his young daughter, Matilda. His career was still moving forward. There was no simple indication that his story was about to end. That is one reason the news of his death was so shocking. On January 22, 2008, Heath Ledger was found unresponsive in his apartment in New York City. He was only 28 years old. The news spread rapidly through the entertainment world. Friends, fellow actors, filmmakers and fans were stunned. For many people, it was difficult to understand how someone so young, and seemingly at the beginning of an extraordinary career, could suddenly be gone. Authorities investigated the circumstances surrounding his death. The official cause was determined to be acute intoxication from the combined effects of several prescription medications. It was officially ruled an accident. That distinction matters because, after his death, many rumors and dramatic stories began circulating about Heath and his preparation for the Joker. Some stories claimed that the role itself had caused his death. Others suggested that he had deliberately isolated himself or that the character had somehow consumed his life. Those claims became part of the mythology surrounding him. But there is no reliable evidence that playing the Joker caused his death. His death was a tragedy involving prescription medications, and turning it into a simple Hollywood legend can obscure the real human story. For his family and friends, this wasn't a movie story. It was the loss of a son. A father. A brother. A friend. And an actor whose career had been cut short far too early. The public, however, was still waiting for something Heath had left behind. The Dark Knight. The film had already been completed. But Heath would never be there to watch audiences experience his performance. When the movie was released in 2008, the response was extraordinary. The film became a major critical and commercial success. And Heath Ledger's Joker immediately became the center of attention. Audiences saw something they had never quite seen before. The Joker wasn't presented as a traditional comic book villain. He was unpredictable. He was unsettling. Sometimes he was strangely humorous. And sometimes his silence was more disturbing than his words. The performance had incredible control. Heath understood that the Joker didn't need to explain himself. The less predictable he was, the more powerful he became. His physical performance was just as important as his dialogue. The way he tilted his head. The way he walked. The way he smiled. The way he paused before speaking. All of these small details created a character who felt completely alive. And audiences began to realize just how extraordinary Heath's final performance had been. The tragedy of his death changed the way people watched the film. Every scene carried another layer of emotion. People knew that the actor behind the makeup was no longer alive. But the character on the screen was incredibly alive. That contrast made the performance even more haunting. Then came awards season. Heath received numerous posthumous honors for his work as the Joker. In 2009, he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. He became only the second person to receive an acting Oscar posthumously at that time. His family accepted the award on his behalf. It was a remarkable moment. The young actor from Perth, who had once traveled across the world searching for opportunities, was now being honored at the highest level of the film industry. But the award could never replace him. That was the painful reality. Recognition came after his death. The success he had been building became even greater after he was gone. And audiences began looking back at his earlier work differently. People revisited Brokeback Mountain. They returned to A Knight's Tale. They rediscovered 10 Things I Hate About You. And they began seeing a pattern. Heath had spent his career refusing to stay in one category. He could play a romantic lead. A historical character. A troubled young man. A complex dramatic role. And eventually, one of cinema's most famous villains. He had repeatedly chosen transformation over comfort. That may be one of the most important parts of his legacy. Heath Ledger's career lasted only a little more than a decade. But within that relatively short period, he demonstrated remarkable range. He didn't make dozens and dozens of films. Instead, many of the films he did make became memorable for completely different reasons. His career wasn't about quantity. It was about the choices he made. And perhaps that is why his story continues to resonate. He didn't have the chance to grow old in Hollywood. He didn't get to see how his career might have developed. He didn't get to choose the next role after the Joker. He didn't get to experience the full impact of the recognition that came after his death. There were still countless stories he could have told. Countless characters he could have played. And an entire future that remained unwritten. That unfinished future is part of what makes Heath Ledger's story so powerful. Not because his life should be romanticized or reduced to tragedy. But because his career showed just how much potential one person could demonstrate in such a short time. From Perth to Hollywood. From teenage television to international cinema. From romantic comedy to serious drama. And finally, to one of the most iconic performances of his generation. Heath Ledger had already changed the way audiences saw him. And even after his death, his work continued changing the way audiences saw him. But the story wasn't finished. Because the most lasting part of Heath Ledger's legacy wasn't simply the awards. It wasn't just the Joker. It was the idea that an actor should never be afraid to take risks. To change. To experiment. To become something audiences don't expect. And that is exactly what Heath did. Heath Ledger's story ended far too early. He was only 28 years old when his life came to an end. But the strange thing about some artists is that their work continues to grow even after they are gone. And that is exactly what happened with Heath Ledger. When The Dark Knight was released in 2008, audiences finally saw the performance Heath had created. The reaction was enormous. People weren't simply talking about the movie. They were talking about the Joker. The character had become one of the most memorable villains in modern cinema. But what made the performance so powerful wasn't simply the makeup, the voice, or the appearance. It was the uncertainty. You never completely knew what the Joker would do next. Heath created a character who could appear calm one moment and completely unpredictable the next. He didn't play the Joker like someone trying to prove he was powerful. He played him like someone who didn't care whether anyone understood him. That made the character feel dangerous. And it changed superhero cinema. After The Dark Knight, filmmakers began approaching comic book villains differently. Villains could be complex. They could be psychologically interesting. They could carry emotional weight. They didn't have to exist simply to give the hero someone to fight. Heath's performance helped demonstrate that a superhero movie could also be serious filmmaking. But his legacy goes beyond the Joker. If we look back at his career, something becomes clear. Heath Ledger repeatedly refused to stay in one category. He could have continued making romantic movies after becoming famous. He could have built a comfortable career playing the same type of character. Instead, he kept taking risks. He chose roles that challenged him. He worked with directors who demanded something different. He allowed himself to look vulnerable. He allowed himself to look strange. And eventually, he completely transformed himself into one of cinema's most recognizable villains. That willingness to change may be his greatest legacy. Heath's story also reminds us that success is not always a straight line. His career began in Australia. Then he moved to Hollywood. He became a young star. He became a serious dramatic actor. He became an acclaimed performer. And finally, he created a performance that became part of cinematic history. All of that happened in a relatively short period. But there was another part of Heath's life that should never be forgotten. He was a father. His daughter, Matilda, was born in 2005. Behind all the movie posters and red carpets was a person whose life included ordinary relationships, family responsibilities, and private moments. That human side is important. Because when someone becomes a legend, people often remember the image more than the person. Heath Ledger was not simply the Joker. He was not simply an Oscar winner. He was not simply a Hollywood star. He was a son. A brother. A father. A friend. And an actor who was still discovering what he could become. His death left an enormous unanswered question. What would Heath Ledger have done next? That question has no answer. And perhaps that's one of the most difficult parts of his story. He had already achieved so much. But his career still had so much potential left. He could have worked with new directors. Played completely different characters. Produced films. Directed. Changed as an artist. We will never know. The future he might have created disappeared with him. But the work he left behind remains. Years after his death, people still discover his performances for the first time. Young audiences who weren't even alive when he died watch The Dark Knight and experience his Joker without having known the actor personally. They simply see the performance. And that is the ultimate test of an actor's legacy. Does the work survive the person? In Heath Ledger's case, it did. The Joker remains one of the most discussed performances in modern cinema. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute to Heath isn't simply remembering one character. It's remembering the courage behind his career choices. He didn't want to be predictable. He didn't want to be trapped by his appearance. He didn't want Hollywood to decide who he was. He kept changing. And that is why his relatively short career feels much larger than it actually was. From a teenager in Perth. To an ambitious young actor in Australia. To a newcomer in Hollywood. To a respected dramatic performer. And finally, to the Joker. The journey was extraordinary. But it was also unfinished. Heath Ledger never had the opportunity to see the full impact of his work. He never stood on an Oscar stage to accept the award himself. He never watched audiences react to his success from the other side of the screen. His family accepted the Academy Award in his honor. And that moment became one of the most emotional chapters in his story. The award recognized his talent. But no trophy could tell the entire story. Because Heath's greatest achievement wasn't simply winning an award. It was creating performances that people still talk about years later. It was proving that a young actor from Australia could enter Hollywood and completely redefine expectations. It was showing that taking risks could create something unforgettable. And it was leaving behind work that continues to inspire actors and filmmakers. There are many Hollywood stories about fame. Some are about wealth. Some are about success. Some are about becoming famous overnight. Heath Ledger's story is different. It's about transformation. About refusing to remain the person people expected him to be. And about how much an artist can accomplish when they are willing to take creative risks. His life was short. His career was relatively short. But his influence became much larger than the years he had. And maybe that is why his name continues to appear whenever people discuss the greatest performances in modern cinema. Not because his life should be defined by tragedy. But because his work deserves to be remembered on its own. Heath Ledger once arrived in Hollywood as a young Australian actor with something to prove. He left behind a body of work that proved it for him. The boy from Perth became a Hollywood star. The Hollywood star became a respected actor. And the actor became a cinematic legend. His story ended in 2008. But his performances didn't. They remained on screen. They remained in memories. And they continued reaching new audiences. Because great performances don't disappear when the actor is gone. They wait. For another person to watch. Another generation to discover. Another audience to feel the same emotion. And every time that happens, Heath Ledger's work lives again. Heath Ledger's time was short. But his impact was anything but. Clapperboard the end, Heath Ledger, the legacy that never faded. Clapperboard.